Chapter 19, MESSANDI. King's Landing had been sealed off for weeks, its gates closed and its walls bristling with tension, as if the city itself were holding its breath against what was to come. Cersei had sealed the city the way she sealed everything she decided was hers, completely without negotiation. The gate closed and the chains up and the harbor watched, and the population managed by men with swords, and the specific understanding that the swords were for use. She had filled the city guard with new soldiers, small folk, dockworkers, tanners and bakers and apprentices, offered coin for compliance, and the understanding that coin would stop coming and worse would start if they didn't comply. They were not good soldiers. They needed to be present and armed and sufficiently afraid of what Cersei would do if they failed to make the population more afraid of the same. The city had been boiling for weeks, trapped, hungry, governed by fear. The anger had gone underground and built pressure, and the pressure had nowhere to go, and all of that was the city Daenerys was riding toward. Daenerys received word of Missandei on the afternoon of the day before she intended to march. A raven, brief and deliberately cruel. "Your friend is with us. Come to the gates and we will discuss terms." She went to the gates on Drogon, not armed, not accompanied by armies, but mounted, elevated, the largest thing in the immediate vicinity as a matter of simple fact. She was not alone behind her. Just beyond the ridge, Jon rode at the head of the unsullied column, with the Dothraki spreading wide on either flank. Daenerys had ridden ahead on Drogon, visible and deliberate, a single rider on a dragon come to offer terms before the armies arrived. Cersei would know what rode behind. She landed at a distance safe from the range of Scorpion, and looked up at the walls of King's Landing and saw Missandei. Missandei was standing on the walls above the gate in chains, stripped from her clothing beside a group of unsullied similarly restrained. She was composed in the way that certain people were composed in unbearable situations, not because they were not afraid but because they had decided to present themselves on their own terms regardless. Her head was up. Missandei's body bore the evidence of what had been done to her, wounds on her body, her lips, cheeks and nose, eyes swollen shut. Fresh blood coming from her mouth and trailing down her neck. The unsullied beside her stood with the rigid stillness of trained soldiers, but the marks on them were plain. Cersei had wanted Daenerys to see the cost of resistance before she heard a single word. Cersei stood nearby. She looked down at Daenerys with the expression she reserved for situations in which she held the advantage and intended to use it. Above the gate itself, one level up, Euron Greyjoy stood at a Scorpion battery, watching the scene below with the alert patience of a man waiting for the exact right moment. He had positioned himself there before dawn. "Turn back," Cersei called down from the walls, her voice steady and unyielding. "Yield King's Landing and no further harm will come to your friends." Daenerys looked up at her. She looked at Missandei in her chains, at the beaten unsullied beside her, at everything Cersei had already done to make her point. "Release them," she said. Her voice carried just as well. "Give us back our friends, surrender King's Landing, and we will spare you, all of you." Cersei's expression didn't shift. She glanced sideways almost lazily. The soldiers behind the unsullied moved. 5 of them went down in a single motion, cut from behind with the efficiency of men who had been given their orders before dawn. Daenerys felt it like cold water through her chest. "Leave," Cersei said pleasantly, "and your subjects will live." Daenerys wanted to turn. She understood the arithmetic. Every moment she stayed was costing lives, and Cersei would keep paying them out one by one until there were none left or until Daenerys broke. She could feel herself on the edge of it, the pull toward retreat, toward buying time, toward anything that would stop the bleeding. She prepared Drogon. She steadied herself. "Release my friends," she said, one more time clearly. "No one else needs to die, you have my word." Cersei nodded again. 5 more unsullied fell. Drogon felt it, the grief and the decision arriving at the same moment, and spread his wings. His distress bled through to Daenerys in the bond they shared, the dragon's ancient instinct recognizing something final. Daenerys pressed her hand to his neck. She almost gave in. She was a breath away from turning. In that moment, Daenerys understood. She had underestimated Cersei's cruelty, had held to the hope that Cersei in the end would choose survival over spite. She had been wrong. If she did not yield now, Missandei would die. And then there would be war, and thousands would burn by dragonfire, and the city she had come to free would be consumed by the fire she brought. None of it would bring Missandei back. She had not come to be the Mad King's daughter. She yielded. She pressed her hand to Drogon's neck and began to turn him away from the walls. Cersei, above the gate, allowed herself a small and satisfied smile, looking down at the turning dragon with the expression of a woman who had played the only card that mattered and found it sufficient. Euron was not watching Cersei. As Drogon turned, Euron Greyjoy saw his opening. He had been watching from his battery above the gate with the focused patience of a man waiting for exactly this angle. He did not look at Cersei. He did not ask permission. He saw the line and he took it, releasing a bolt aimed at Drogon's turning head with the confident precision of someone who had been calculating this geometry since before dawn. Daenerys saw it a half-second before Drogon, and Drogon wrenched his head sharply before the bolt struck. The bolt missed his skull and impacted his scaled breastplate instead, biting deep enough to draw blood and make Drogon scream, but not deep enough to reach anything vital. The wound was real and painful, but it would not kill him. "Stand down," Cersei said sharply and clearly. "Stand." The other scorpion batteries opened up. Daenerys looked at Euron from atop Drogon's back, the full weight of her fury finding him on the wall above the gate. Then she made Drogon climb, carrying her anger with her into the sky. Below, the Golden Company surged forward from their positions, and the battle began, the battle that Cersei, in her confidence, had decided she could prevent, and that Euron had just made inevitable. Missandei of Noth stood in her chains above the gate. She had watched the dragon turn away. She had watched Daenerys yield. She had watched Cersei's satisfaction, and she made her choice, the last one that was entirely hers to make. The final act of someone who had spent a life in service, and was choosing, at the end, to speak for herself. One word, the last and most defiant thing she had to give. Then Missandei's voice rang out, "Dracarys." Daenerys looked at her for one moment, then Drogon climbed. On the walls, Cersei's head snapped toward Euron's position. Her expression was not panic. It was the controlled fury of a woman who had not given an order, and had just watched someone act on their own initiative in a situation where her survival depended on controlling exactly this kind of initiative. She said it once more, "Euron, stand down," and he released. Euron was already cranking for his third shot. He had found his angle. He was not listening. He did not look at her. He had decided the moment was his and he was inside it, and Cersei Lannister, for all her power, was not a fact he was attending to right now. He missed again. Daenerys had already moved Drogon higher. Cersei looked at the bolt disappearing uselessly into the sky. She looked at the dragon, now beyond range. She looked at Euron, who was reaching for the next bolt with the satisfied focus of a man who has found the thing he loved to do and has no interest in being interrupted. She understood in that moment what he had just done. He had started a war she was no longer certain she could win. She looked at the dragon climbing beyond range. She looked at the field below, where her advantage was evaporating by the second. She had miscalculated and she knew it. She said nothing. She nodded to the mountain. He moved forward and with a swing of his greatsword he cleaved Missandei in two. Missandei died having chosen her moment, having meant it. Then Cersei turned and walked back into the Red Keep, and the mountain followed behind her. From the skis above King's Landing, the Queen of Dragons watched it happen, and she did not look away, because Missandei had not looked away, and the least she could do was witness it. Jon saw her face as she ascended into the sky, watched the grief move through it and become something else, something he had not seen there before in quite that form, something that had run out of restraint. He thought, "She is going to burn the city." He felt it as fear rather than certainty, and the fear moved him immediately. He was already turning toward Grey Worm before Drogon had fully cleared the scorpions. Grey Worm, watching from the command position below, watched the queen go aloft. He watched her face as she rose, and he read in it something he understood: the grief below and the resolve above, because he was carrying the same thing, had been carrying it since Euron's fleet, and he had found that grief and duty could occupy the same space without either one diminishing the other. He would grieve later. Right now there was work. He gave the order. The Unsullied advanced. The Dothraki swept in from the flanks, the enormous cavalry charge that had ended armies on 3 continents, the ground shaking under the hooves of 5,000 horses. The Golden Company had deployed in front of the gates and walls, not hiding behind stone, but standing in the open approach, a professional army of hardened sellswords in formation between the advancing forces and the city, their commanders having decided that meeting the enemy in the open was better than waiting to be swept off the walls. They were good soldiers. They held the approach and made the Unsullied pay for every yard. Drogon climbed. He climbed very high, higher than Scorpion range, a black shape against the gray sky, circling with the deliberate patience of something that was choosing its moment. The scorpions on the walls tracked him, the operators cranking the gears, following the black shape against the clouds. On the wall above the gate, Euron Greyjoy fired again. He had been watching Drogon's pattern, calculating the geometry of the circle, and he released at the moment he believed was right. The bolt crossed the sky in a flat line and missed the black wing by 10 yards. The scorpion operators were firing. Euron began to crank for another shot. He was enjoying this. A second pass of the circle, and he released again, closer, close enough that Daenerys felt Drogon flinch. Euron smiled and reached for the next bolt. They were all watching Drogon. Rhaegar appeared from the east. Euron heard the sound Rhaegar made, a specific high pitch. Not the deep thunder of Drogon, but something faster and more precise, coming from the east at an altitude that made no tactical sense until it did, all at once, when she was already over the outer district, and coming in too low and too fast for the Scorpion to track. Euron looked at her for exactly 1 second. He had spent a great deal of his life knowing when a position was no longer tenable. He leapt from the Scorpion and ran down the wall at speed, and he was gone before Rhaegar crossed the inner walls. She came in low and fast, lower than anyone would have expected a dragon to fly in a siege situation, skimming the rooftops outside the wall at an altitude that left no room for error, and no time for the Scorpion operators on the eastern walls to track and respond. She moved with the economy she always moved with in a crisis, no wasted motion, no performance, just the most direct line from here to the target. The Scorpion emplacements above the eastern gates burned one after another in focused streams of dragonfire, the metal warping and the operators throwing themselves clear, or not clearing in time, and Rhaegar was past them and climbing before the surviving crews could bring their weapons to bear. The western Scorpions turned toward her. Drogon dropped. He came down from his height with the velocity of something very large falling very fast, and the Scorpion operators who had been tracking Rhaegar had exactly enough time to understand what was happening before the fire arrived. The western wall emplacements burned. The gate mechanisms burned. The gate itself buckled and collapsed under a sustained stream of dragonfire directed at the giant steel hinges. The gates of King's Landing were open. At the base of the gate, the fighting was close and personal. Jon led the push through the outer formation with Grey Worm at his left shoulder and Yara Greyjoy at his right, the Iron Islander fighting with the compact brutality of her islands, short blade and no wasted movement. Behind them came Brienne of Tarth with Oathkeeper, Podrick Payne with an unsullied spear, and the expression of a man who had long since decided that being afraid and keeping going were not mutually exclusive. Jaime Lannister with Widow's Wail in his left hand, and Sandor Clegane with a long sword and the permanent disposition of a man who has nothing left to protect and finds it freeing. Tormund Giantsbane was not, technically, supposed to be at King's Landing. He had explained this to several people over the course of the voyage south, each of whom had asked variations of the same question. The Watch needs the wildlings back north, was the most common objection. There's nothing left for you to fight here. Jon needed men, Tormund had said each time with great certainty. This was true. It was also not entirely the reason. Brienne of Tarth was 3 positions to his left in the formation outside the gates, and Tormund had not volunteered for a siege of King's Landing because of Jon Snow. He had volunteered because Brienne of Tarth was going to be there, and Tormund Giantsbane had reached the age at which a man stopped pretending his reasons were other than they were, at least to himself. To everyone else he maintained the Jon story with complete conviction. Gendry was beside him, war hammer in both hands, with the expression of a man who has decided to think about this very little and act on instinct entirely. The gates buckled under Drogon's fire, and the order came down the line. Gendry moved with the hammer the way he moved with everything, forward, without elegance, with a consistency that the Golden Company's front line was not equipped to argue with. Tormund fought beside him with the cheerful ferocity of a man who has been north of the wall for most of his adult life, and finds a professional army comparatively manageable. The Golden Company's front line was professional and braced. They met them with the competence of soldiers who had been doing this for decades. What they had not prepared for was the combination, Grey Worm finding gaps that shouldn't exist, Yara driving into them before they could close, Brienne's Valyrian steel cutting through armor their steel could not answer. Jaime's left-handed forms were unfamiliar in ways that made experienced fighters hesitate the half-second that decided things. The Hound simply would not stop coming forward, and Jon moved through all of it with Longclaw, finding the places where the Golden Company's discipline was coming apart at the seams. Pod took a cut to the arm and kept going. Brienne registered it without looking. She trusted that he would keep going because he always had. The Unsullied advanced through them. The Golden Company broke, not all of them, not immediately, but enough. The rear lines dissolving first as men who had signed a contract to fight a war, decided that this particular war had become something other than advertised. The front lines held longer, professionals fighting with the grim competence of people who had nowhere to run to, and the battle in the streets was hard and close and costly. But the gates were open, and the battle, in the way of battles whose outcome had been decided by the opening move, was a matter of time. Chapter 20, Wildfire. Cersei Lannister had known the dead were defeated. She had felt at the moment the strange, oppressive cold that had been seeping even this far south lifted in the night, months before the army appeared on the horizon. She had woken from sleep to the absence of it, to the ordinary cold of a King's Landing winter, and had lain in the dark, and understood that the dead had been defeated, and that whoever had defeated them was now coming for her. She had spent those 2 months preparing. The bells rang less than 30 minutes after the siege began. They rang for surrender, the great bells of the city, the sound that had always meant enough. The bells rang from the sept and from the towers and from the castle itself, a massive rolling sound that Jon heard from his position near the gates. Cersei heard the bells. She gave the order. The first cache detonated beneath the central market, a dull, heavy sound that was more felt than heard, and then the ground lifted, and the buildings above it came apart, and the green fire came up through the gaps in a geyser that climbed 30 feet and spread across the streets and consumed everything it touched. The wildfire was the contingency plan. There were caches beneath King's Landing. Her father had known about them. Tyrion had known about them. The pyromancers had storing them under the Mad King's direction and had been maintaining them ever since, and the wildfire sat in its ceramic jars in chambers beneath the streets, connected by a network of tunnels and passages. Cersei had spent the past weeks extending the network, placing new caches beneath the central market, beneath the docks, beneath the most densely populated districts of the city, beneath the old merchant quarter that had always been the most crowded and the most difficult to control. She had not placed them where she thought the battle would be. She had placed them where the people were. Not because she hated the people, because the people were the city, and the city was the last leverage she had, and leverage was all she had ever truly understood. It found the morning market crowds, the vendors and the buyers and the children and the old men sitting in the sun, and it consumed them with the absolute thoroughness of wildfire, which did not distinguish between combatants and not. The second cache went beneath the docks, the old timber structures catching in an instant, the green fire spreading across the waterfront in both directions. The people who had crowded toward the docks to watch the battle and potentially flee now caught between fire and water with nowhere to go. The third cache detonated beneath the old merchant quarter, in the heart of the oldest and most crowded part of the city, and this one was the largest, and what it did to the buildings above it and the streets between them and the people who lived in that warren of narrow lanes was a thing that would not be described fully in any account written afterward, because no one who survived wanted to describe it fully, and those who had been at the center of it were not available to describe anything. 3 caches, perhaps 1,000 dead in the first minutes, perhaps more. Tyrion saw the first explosion from the gate. He stood on the rubble of the gate and looked at the green fire rising from the market district and felt something cold move through him that was not the temperature. 3 caches. 3, out of however many she had prepared, and 3 had done this. He thought, it doesn't matter how many more there are. The city is burning now and people are dying now, and that is what matters now. Help them, he said. He said it to Sir Davos, who was beside him. He said it to the unsullied commanders. He said it to the Dothraki who were streaming through the gate. The invasion is over. Help them. Get to the fire. Find the survivors. Move. He walked into the burning city and started doing it himself, because the people Tyrion moved were people who watched where he moved. Grey Worm moved beside him, coordinating the unsullied with the precision that was Grey Worm's defining quality. He ordered a score of his men to make for the dungeons beneath the castle and locate the prisoners. Then he pressed on with the rest, driving them toward the fiercest of the fires, organizing human chains to reach the trapped, applying a soldier's mind to a civilian crisis with the same competence he applied to everything else. He did not speak of Missandei. He worked. The grief was in the work. In the passages below the city, 6 men who had never spoken to one another stopped running. They had been given their orders before dawn, each assigned to a specific cache, a specific passage, a specific moment. They were pyromancers or men who worked alongside them, people who understood the chemistry of what they carried and had agreed, for coin and for fear of Cersei, to light what they had been told to light. The first explosion had done what it was meant to do. The second had done what it was meant to do. The third had shaken the ground under their feet and filled the passages with smoke and the sound of something above them coming apart. And then in the dark beneath the city, 6 men stopped and thought about what they were. The city had fallen. They had heard it in the ground, the Dothraki charge, the battering at the gates, the screaming from above that had shifted from a battle sound to something else. Cersei Lannister, the queen who had ordered them here, was losing. Perhaps had already lost. The golden contract that had promised them safety on the other side of what they were being asked to do had been made with a woman who was running out of tomorrow. They had served the Mad Queen, and the Mad Queen had burned her own city and lost, and they owed her nothing. They had been afraid of her, which was different. They owed her nothing. One by one, they set down their torches and walked back through the passages toward the light above. None of them spoke to the others. None of them needed to. The remaining caches sat in their chambers beneath the city, untouched and silent, as the fighting above them slowly ceased. Euron Greyjoy did not die above the walls. He had prepared for the loss of the city the same way he had prepared for everything. by having an exit, a private one, that he had never told Cersei about because telling Cersei things was how you lost exits. There were passages in the Red Keep older than the keep itself, passages that the histories mentioned in passing, and that most people assumed had been sealed. Some of them had not been. Euron knew which ones. He had spent days before Daenerys' arrival learning them, quietly, because Euron Greyjoy had always prepared for the version of events where things went badly. He moved through the passages with the controlled urgency of a man who is not panicking, but who is moving quickly because quickly was required. He reached the lower passages and followed them toward the harbor, toward the small boat he had stored in the sea cave below the cliffs. Nothing grand, nothing that would be noticed, just a boat and an oar and the sea, which was his. He reached the cove. The boat was there, tucked against the rock where he had left it, small and unremarkable and everything he needed. He climbed down the last of the cliff path and stepped onto the wet stone of the cove floor and looked at the boat and looked at the open water beyond the cave's mouth, and what he saw stopped him. Out on the harbor, beyond the burning city and the smoke and the sounds of the battle he was escaping, the Greyjoy fleet was engaged. Not his fleet fighting Daenerys' fleet, his fleet fighting another fleet of iron-born ships, longships with familiar lines, striking from the southwest into the flank of the Silence's escort. Yara's ships. He recognized the configuration immediately, because he had spent his whole life learning to read the sea and what moved on it. As he watched, a fireship came in on the Silence herself. His ship, his magnificent Silence, the ship he had built as an extension of his will, and struck her amidships, and the fire caught in the rigging and spread with the enthusiasm of fire that has found exactly the right conditions, and the Silence began to burn. She was far enough out that he could not hear the screaming, only see the orange light of her against the dark water. Euron Greyjoy stood in his cave and watched his ship burn for a long moment. His expression was not what most people would have expected, not grief, not rage, but something quieter, something almost like recognition. He had always known, somewhere below conscious thought, that the sea gave and the sea took, and that everything he'd built would eventually be taken back by something. He had just not expected it to be his sister. The Unsullied had found him in the cove. He did not know how, whether someone had talked, whether Grey Worm had simply been thorough in ways that Euron had underestimated. There were 6 of them in the cave and 10 lengths between him and the boat. Euron Greyjoy drew his sword and fought because that was what he did. He was good. He was not good enough. The cave was close quarters, and the Unsullied had been trained for close quarters by people who had made it their profession, and there were 6 of them. He died in the cave with salt water at his feet, and the sound of the sea outside, which was more than he deserved and less than he would have wanted.